Los Angeles in 1871 was not the sprawling metropolis we know today. It was a small, dusty town, a remote outpost on the American frontier. The city's population was barely 6,000 souls, a mix of Californios, Anglo-Americans, Europeans, and a growing number of Chinese immigrants. The streets were unpaved, turning to thick mud in the winter rains and choking dust in the summer heat. Adobe buildings with flat roofs lined the main thoroughfares, their simple construction a testament to the city's Spanish and Mexican heritage. It was a place caught between its past and its future, a raw and untamed settlement where civilization felt like a fragile veneer. Life was hard, and the comforts of the East Coast were a world away. The air itself seemed to carry a sense of lawlessness. This was a city where the nearest significant American settlement was San Francisco, a long and arduous journey away. Los Angeles existed in a state of relative isolation, which fostered a spirit of independence but also a deep-seated culture of violence. The city had one of the highest murder rates in the United States, a grim statistic that earned it a reputation as a dangerous place. People settled their disputes not in courtrooms but with fists, knives, and pistols. The sound of a gunshot in the street was a common occurrence, often met with little more than a shrug from those who had grown accustomed to the daily threat of sudden death. The forces of law and order were laughably inadequate for the task of policing such a volatile population. The city employed only a handful of police officers, often no more than 6 men at any given time to patrol the entire area. These men were poorly paid, frequently outgunned, and tasked with keeping a lid on a boiling pot of racial tensions, gambling disputes, and drunken brawls. Their presence did little to deter the criminal element that thrived in the city's saloons and gambling dens. For most citizens, self-reliance was the only true form of protection. Justice was often a personal matter, swift and brutal, carried out long before any official could intervene. In this raw and violent setting, daily life was a struggle for survival. The city was a collection of disparate communities, each wary of the other. The lack of a strong, centralized authority meant that power often rested in the hands of the mob. It was a place of stark contrast where the beautiful, sun-drenched landscape stood in opposition to the dark and dangerous character of the city itself. This was the Los Angeles of 1871, a frontier town teetering on the brink, where the promise of a new life in the West was shadowed by the constant presence of death. The stage was set for a tragedy that would forever mark its history. Violence was woven into the very fabric of Los Angeles in the years following the Civil War. It was not an occasional disruption of the peace, it was the norm. The city was widely known as one of the most dangerous places in America, a title it earned through a staggering rate of homicides. Historians estimate that the murder rate was higher than in notorious cowtowns like Dodge City or Tombstone. Men walked the streets armed, and arguments over card games, business deals, or personal insults could quickly escalate into deadly confrontations. The local newspapers were filled with brief, matter-of-fact accounts of stabbings and shootings, treating them as routine events of city life. This culture of violence was fueled by a number of factors. The city was a melting pot of different cultures and ethnicities, but this diversity did not lead to harmony. Instead, it created deep-seated mistrust and racial animosity. Tensions between the established California families, the newly arrived Anglo-Americans, and immigrant groups from Europe and Asia were always simmering just below the surface. Furthermore, the transient nature of the population, with many single men seeking fortune and adventure, contributed to the instability. These men, far from their homes and the social constraints of their communities, often gave in to their worst impulses in the city's many saloons and gambling halls. The saloons were the epicenter of this violent culture. They were more than just places to drink. They were social hubs, business centers, and flashpoints for conflict. Men gathered to gamble, make deals, and settle scores. Alcohol flowed freely, loosening inhibitions and shortening tempers. A perceived slight or a dispute over a hand of cards could easily end with drawn weapons. The line between revelry and bloodshed was perilously thin. The constant threat of violence created an atmosphere of paranoia and aggression, where a man's reputation and survival often depended on his willingness to fight. For the ordinary residents of Los Angeles, this environment of pervasive danger shaped their daily existence. They learned to be cautious, to avoid certain streets after dark, and to mind their own business. The sounds of a brawl or a gunshot might draw curious onlookers, but few would dare to intervene. The city's law enforcement was simply too small and ineffective to provide any real sense of security. People understood that they were largely on their own. This reality fostered a grim acceptance of violence as an unavoidable part of life on the frontier, a brutal cost of living in a city that was still struggling to find its soul. When official law enforcement was weak, the people of Los Angeles often took the law into their own hands. The city had a dark and well-established tradition of mob justice. Vigilante committees, composed of some of the city's most prominent citizens, would form to hunt down and punish suspected criminals. This form of justice was swift, public, and brutal. It bypassed the legal system entirely, denying the accused any chance of a fair trial. The reasoning was simple. The courts were seen as slow, corrupt, and ineffective. For many Angelenos, the rope and the nearest sturdy tree branch were the most reliable tools for maintaining order in a chaotic world. Lynchings were disturbingly common in Los Angeles during this period. They were not secret affairs conducted under the cover of darkness. Instead, they were often public spectacles, carried out in broad daylight and attended by large, sometimes cheering crowds. A man accused of a serious crime such as murder or horse theft could find himself at the mercy of a mob within hours of the accusation. The process was terrifyingly efficient. A crowd would gather, passions would be inflamed, and a makeshift noose would be produced. The victim would be dragged to a prominent location, often a large gateway or a sturdy corral post, and summarily executed. These acts of mob violence were not just about punishing a specific crime. They were also a powerful expression of the community's anxieties and prejudices. The victims of lynch mobs were disproportionately non-white. Native Americans, Latinos, and increasingly, Chinese immigrants were targeted with particular ferocity. The mob acted as an instrument of social control, reinforcing the existing racial hierarchy and sending a clear message to minority communities about their precarious place in the city. An accusation against a person of color, whether true or false, was far more likely to result in a lynching than a similar accusation against a white person. The acceptance of this brutal form of justice revealed the deep flaws in the city's character. It showed a community that valued order over law and retribution over due process. The leaders who participated in or condoned these lynchings saw themselves as protectors of the community, stepping in where the official government failed. However, their actions normalized a culture of violence and terror that would have devastating consequences. The readiness of the Los Angeles mob to dispense justice with a rope was a frightening precedent, one that set the stage for one of the darkest days in the city's history. Into this volatile mix of frontier life came a new group of immigrants, the Chinese. By 1871, the Chinese community in Los Angeles was still small, numbering fewer than 200 people in a city of nearly 6,000. Most were young men who had come to California, or Gold Mountain, seeking economic opportunity. They had been drawn by the promise of work, first in the gold fields and then on the Transcontinental Railroad. As these opportunities dwindled, many sought their fortunes in the growing towns and cities of the West, including the small pueblo of Los Angeles. They arrived with hopes of earning money to send back to their families in China. These newcomers were overwhelmingly male. The high cost of passage and restrictive American laws made it nearly impossible for Chinese women and families to immigrate. This demographic imbalance created a bachelor society where men lived and worked together in close quarters. They took on jobs that others did not want, working as laundrymen, cooks, and agricultural laborers. They were known for their strong work ethic and their willingness to perform difficult and low-paying tasks. In a short time, they established a small but visible presence in the economic life of Los Angeles, running small businesses and providing essential services to the wider community. The Chinese community settled together for reasons of both choice and necessity. They found comfort and support in living among their own people who spoke their language and understood their customs. It allowed them to maintain their cultural traditions in a foreign land. But they also clustered together because they were not welcome elsewhere. Anti-Chinese sentiment was rampant throughout California, and Los Angeles was no exception. White residents viewed them with suspicion and hostility, seeing them as strange, clannish, and an economic threat. This prejudice forced the Chinese to seek refuge in a specific, marginalized part of the city. The area where they settled was a short, dilapidated street known as Calle de los Negros, or Negro Alley. This was the most notorious and dangerous part of Los Angeles. a place already known for its crime and vice. The Chinese did not choose this location because they were drawn to its sordid character. They settled there because it was the only place they could. Property owners in more respectable parts of the city refused to rent or sell to them. Forced into the city's underbelly, the Chinese community began to build a new life for itself, carving out a space in the one corner of Los Angeles that would have them. Calle de los Negros, or Negro Alley, was the dark heart of Los Angeles. It wasn't exactly a long street, just a single block running between the main plaza and Alameda Street. But, its reputation was immense and honestly pretty sinister. The name itself was a misnomer, a holdover from an earlier era when it was home to darker-skinned Californios. By the 1870s, it had become the city's primary den of iniquity, a place where all forms of vice were openly bought and sold. It was a street lined with saloons, gambling houses, brothels, and opium dens. Respectable citizens, especially women and children, avoided it at all costs, even in broad daylight. The alley was a magnet for the most disreputable elements of society. Cowboys looking to spend their wages on drink and entertainment, hard-bitten miners, professional gamblers, and outlaws on the run. These were the folks who frequented the place. Fights were a nightly, if not hourly, occurrence. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey, stale cigar smoke, and, unwashed bodies. The sounds of the alley were this chaotic symphony of loud music from the saloons, shouted curses, and every now and then, the crack of a gunshot that would send people scattering. It was here, in this lawless enclave, that the city's violent nature was most concentrated and, really, on full display. This was the neighborhood that became the first Chinatown of Los Angeles. The Chinese were forced to make their homes and businesses in the rundown adobe buildings that lined this dangerous street. They rented space from a wealthy and powerful landowner, a French-Canadian man who saw an opportunity to profit from the marginalized community. The Chinese residents lived in cramped quarters, often in the back rooms of the laundries, shops, and restaurants they operated. They were surrounded on all sides by the very worst the city had to offer, living and working in the shadow of constant danger. Despite its location, the Chinese section of Negro Alley was, in some ways, an island of industry within a sea of dissolution. While the rest of the alley was dedicated to vice, the Chinese were focused on work. They ran their businesses with diligence, seeking to build a foothold in their new country. Yet they could not escape the alley's reputation. To the white residents of Los Angeles, the Chinese presence in Negro Alley only confirmed their prejudices. They conflated the Chinese community with the crime and depravity that surrounded them, viewing Chinatown not as a place of refuge, but as an extension of the alley's wickedness. For the Chinese residents of Negro Alley, daily life was a precarious balance of hard work, community solidarity, and constant vigilance. Their world was largely confined to this single block and, the immediate surrounding area. They woke early to begin their work, washing clothes, cooking food, or tending to small shops. The sounds and smells of their own community, the sizzle of cooking oil, the chatter in Cantonese dialects, the scent of incense, mingled with the ever-present chaos of the alley outside their doors. They created a semblance of home in this hostile environment, finding comfort in shared meals and familiar customs. Community was essential for survival. The Chinese residents were organized into district associations, which provided support and a form of self-governance. These groups helped newcomers find jobs and housing, mediated disputes, and organized social and religious events. In a city where they had no legal or political power, these associations were a vital source of strength and order. They also sponsored festivals, like the Lunar New Year, which brought a rare splash of color and celebration to the grim surroundings of Negro Alley. These traditions were a lifeline, connecting them to their heritage and to each other. However, they could never fully escape the dangers of their neighborhood. They were frequent targets of theft and harassment. Drunken men stumbling out of the saloons would often bully or attack them, knowing that their victims had little recourse. The Chinese were often cheated by customers and exploited by their landlord, but they had to endure these injustices quietly. To protest too loudly could invite even greater violence. They learned to be wary and unobtrusive, to navigate the treacherous environment of the alley by being as invisible as possible. Their existence was one of constant, low-level fear. This fear was compounded by the internal tensions within the community itself. Rival tongs or secret societies vied for control over the more lucrative enterprises in Chinatown, such as gambling and prostitution. These rivalries could sometimes erupt into violence, further destabilizing the fragile peace of the community. A dispute between two tongs over a woman or control of a gambling operation could have deadly consequences, not just for those directly involved, but for the entire community. These internal conflicts, combined with the external hostility from the wider city, made life in Negro Alley a daily struggle on multiple fronts. The white population of Los Angeles viewed their Chinese neighbors through a lens of deep-seated prejudice and misunderstanding. In the 1870s, anti-Chinese sentiment was a powerful force across the American West, and Los Angeles was no exception. The Chinese were seen as perpetual foreigners, an alien race that could never assimilate into American society. Their different language, clothing, hairstyles, the traditional queue, and customs were all viewed with suspicion and scorn. They were stereotyped as deceitful, clannish, and morally corrupt, caricatures that were reinforced by sensationalist newspaper articles and popular opinion. Economic anxiety was a major driver of this hostility. The Chinese were accused of taking jobs away from white workers because they were willing to work for lower wages. Labor leaders and politicians stoked these fears, portraying the Chinese as a threat to the economic well-being of the white working class. The success of Chinese-owned businesses, particularly laundries, was met with resentment rather than admiration. This economic jealousy was a potent force, creating a narrative that cast the Chinese not as hard-working immigrants, but as an unfair competition that needed to be eliminated for the prosperity of the white community. The location of Chinatown and Negro Alley further poisoned public perception. Because the Chinese lived and worked in the city's most notorious slum, many Angelenos simply assumed they were part of the problem. They associated the Chinese community with the gambling, prostitution, and opium use that were rampant in the alley. While it was true that some Chinese were involved in these activities, so were many whites and Latinos. Yet the vices of the alley became inextricably linked with the Chinese in the public imagination, reinforcing the stereotype of their inherent immorality and depravity. This toxic combination of racial prejudice, economic fear, and moral condemnation created a powder keg of resentment. The Chinese community was largely voiceless and powerless to defend itself against these accusations. They were barred from testifying against whites in court, which meant that crimes committed against them often went unpunished. They became convenient scapegoats for the city's problems. Any social or economic ill could be blamed on the Chinese. This simmering hatred needed only a small spark to erupt into open violence, and in the autumn of 1871, that spark would finally come. The final catastrophic explosion of violence was set in motion by a conflict within the Chinese community itself. The trouble began with a dispute between two rival Chinese tongs over the abduction of a woman named Yut Ho. A man from one tong had helped her escape from another man who had purchased her. This personal conflict quickly escalated into a full-blown tong war, with both sides arming themselves for a confrontation. On the afternoon of October 24, 1871, gunfire broke out between the rival factions in Negro Alley. This internal feud, which normally might have been contained within Chinatown, would soon spiral out of control. As the shooting began, a city police officer named Jesus Bilderain rushed to the scene. He was soon joined by Robert Thompson, a well-known and respected local rancher who had volunteered to help quell the disturbance. As Thompson approached one of the Chinese-occupied buildings, he was shot in the chest and mortally wounded. His death was the catalyst that transformed the incident from a police action into a citywide crisis. Word of Thompson's shooting spread like wildfire through the streets of Los Angeles, igniting the long, simmering hatred of the populace. The narrative quickly formed. The Chinese had killed a white man. A mob began to form, drawn by a thirst for vengeance. It started with a few hundred men but quickly swelled to over 500 people, a significant portion of the city's adult male population. The crowd was a mix of citizens from all walks of life, from common thugs to prominent community leaders. They surrounded Negro Alley, trapping the Chinese residents inside. The few lawmen present were completely overwhelmed and powerless to stop the escalating fury. The mob was not interested in finding the specific individuals responsible for Thompson's death. They were intent on punishing the entire Chinese community. What followed was a night of unspeakable horror. The mob, fueled by racism and rage, broke into the buildings of Chinatown. They dragged Chinese men from their hiding places, beating them and shooting them in the streets. Others were taken to makeshift gallows and lynched from the crossbeams of a large corral gate and the awnings of nearby shops. The rioters looted homes and businesses, stealing money and valuables. For hours, the city descended into a state of absolute anarchy. The mob hunted down and murdered any Chinese person they could find, unleashing a wave of terror that would become one of the worst mass lynchings in American history. The Chinese Massacre of 1871 stands as a brutal and shameful chapter in the history of Los Angeles. When the sun rose on October 25th, the full horror of the night's events was revealed. At least 18 Chinese men and boys had been murdered by the mob, their bodies left hanging or lying in the blood-soaked street of Negro Alley. The city's small Chinatown was left devastated, its residents terrorized and its buildings ransacked. The event brought national and international condemnation, but justice for the victims was fleeting. Although a few rioters were convicted, their sentences were soon overturned on a legal technicality. No one was ever truly held accountable for the massacre. This event reveals the stark difference between the Los Angeles of 1871 and the global city we know today. It was a place where law was fragile and mob rule could take hold with terrifying speed. It was a city deeply divided by race, where prejudice and economic anxiety could easily curdle into murderous violence. The massacre was not a random act of chaos, but the tragic culmination of years of anti-Chinese sentiment and a long-standing culture of frontier brutality. It showed how a community could turn on its most vulnerable members, using them as scapegoats for its own fears and frustrations. In the aftermath, the Chinese community slowly began to rebuild, demonstrating incredible resilience in the face of tragedy. They eventually moved from the ruins of Negro Alley to a new location, establishing the Chinatown that exists today. The massacre, however, left a deep and lasting scar on the city. For many years, the event was largely forgotten, erased from the city's official history and public memory. It was an uncomfortable truth that did not fit with the boosterish image of Los Angeles as a sun-kissed paradise. This historical amnesia did a great disservice to the victims and to the city itself. Reflecting on this dark past is essential for understanding the complex journey of Los Angeles. The city's transformation from a violent, dusty frontier town into a diverse, multicultural metropolis was not a simple or easy process. It was built upon a history that includes moments of profound injustice and cruelty. Remembering the Chinese massacre of 1871 is not about dwelling on shame, but about acknowledging the full story of the city's origins. It reminds us of the dangers of racial hatred and mob violence, and it honors the memory of those who suffered and died in the wild, untamed Los Angeles of a bygone era.